Music consumption is something that's changed pretty wildly in the past couple centuries. For most of human history, we could only experience music live and in person. You could jot down directions for music, you could even draw the shape of vibrations, but the first instance of a medium not just recording sound, but playing it back as well, was in the year 1877, with the invention of wax phonograph cylinders. Thomas Edison is credited as the guy who did it, though he wasn't the only one trying to do it, and it's a little unclear when exactly he did. Nonetheless, physical music begins here. It didn't happen all at once, but from this point on, sound itself could be sold to a wide audience for profit. To skip ahead a century, I would argue that the rise of MP3s and streaming services in the past few years is a similarly big shift in how we listen to music, of course not quite as radical as sound cylinders. Even though this video is about physical music formats, digital is still important to bring up here because that's what made these things niche. Cassette tapes, vinyl records, compact discs, etc. These are now firmly in the realm of hobbyists and superfans. Now I have a soft spot in my heart for dinky little pieces of sound plastic, and given the fact that they've shaped the music of our modern era so heavily, I figured it's worth taking a look at these physical formats and the roles they play, both in the past and nowadays. So let's get back to phonograph cylinders for a sec. These were the ancestors of the vinyl LPs we know and love today. Discs and cylinders competed for a while as shapes until cylinders started to lose ground around the 1910s. There are a few reasons for this. For one thing, it was much easier to store discs because of how thin they were. Also, they were cheaper and had two sides, so you got more bang for your buck with a disc, but cylinders were often a lot more durable. What really gave discs the upper hand, however, was better marketing in the end. Companies were able to hire musicians to record exclusively on discs, and from there they became the default. Originally, the speed at which records spun wasn't really standardized until 1925 when 78 rounds per minute became the norm, meaning each one could have a few minutes of music per side. 5 years later, 33 1/3 RPM records were starting to get introduced to the market, but it wasn't until after World War II that they were refined by Columbia and became a hot commodity. That was essentially the beginning of the format known as albums. Prior to this, sure, you had labels bundling a bunch of 78s into a book and calling them albums, but it wasn't until 33s, aka long plays, that you had the potential for real cohesion. This isn't to say that shorter records were abandoned though, as 45 RPM singles pretty much filled that space from then on. And so that's the origin story for vinyl records. There's obviously been changes since then, but more or less the medium has stayed intact without any major shifts, outside of stuff like stereo usurping mono. At first, LPs were mainly used for classical music and soundtracks, neither of which had been put to wax previously. Very importantly, one genre that absolutely flourished was jazz music. You have to understand there's plenty of genres that can slot themselves into 3-minute chunks just fine, but jazz can be a bit tougher since songs tend to be longer. This meant the recordings previously had to cut down on essential elements like improv that wouldn't fit onto 78s. LPs coming into the picture meant a lot more room to breathe for jazz artists, and pretty quickly masterpieces were popping up left and right in the 50s and 60s. Another musical phenomenon that began in earnest with long plays was the concept album, meaning a group of songs that added up to a larger story or message essentially. Woody Guthrie is credited as the first guy to do it with Dust Bowl Ballads in 1940, which was originally released on 2 different sets of 78s. So concepts were not new, but they were a lot easier when artists could stick them on 1 or 2 discs rather than like 6 or 7. And it speaks to a greater number of artists that created music with an album experience in mind. They began accounting for 15 to 20 minutes of listening per side, and it shaped what sort of music they created. Up until the 80s, vinyl records were the dominant format, and because of that, LPs are pretty much synonymous with the golden age of rock and roll. Nowadays we call it dad rock, of course. Sound quality was great, and plenty of people owned turntables, so for listening at home, vinyl was a no-brainer. But at home was not the only place people wanted to play music. Demand grew for portable music, specifically for use in cars. To that end, there were 2 different products that attempted to fill this role, although, let's be honest, radio was still the go-to. Cassette tapes and 8-tracks were developed around the same time in the mid-60s, cassettes a little earlier, but it was the 8-tracks that took off initially. They worked well enough for a bit, but by 1980 those things were gone. They had a few issues such as being fragile, bigger, and more expensive than cassettes. It became clear that cassettes were a better option for portable music. The audio quality was not amazing, though it's not like it really needed to compete with the vinyl on that front. Tapes could also store a lot more music, around 90 minutes across both sides. A lot of this time this feature wasn't really utilized by popular artists, mainly because records still ruled the market, so artists recorded with those limitations in mind. So, cassettes became the dominant portable format in the late 70s, and only a few years later, they've surpassed records in terms of sales and took over the industry. A big reason for that was cassette players getting marketed more heavily during this time to great success. I mean, when you think of 80s music, you think of the Walkman. Sure, there were flaws with the product, but people were willing to put up with low fidelity, and if they weren't, they could just buy a record copy. The real issue with cassettes, the thing that motivated labels to undertake the expensive shift to compact discs, was reproduction. It was quite easy to record music onto them. This is how mixtapes came about and paved the way for playlists down the line. It also meant that, for basically the first time in the history of recorded music, you could pirate it. That's right, folks, home taping is killing music. Well, it wasn't really. It was arguably making it a whole lot more interesting, giving any person the ability to record their own silly little albums and pass them around to people. It started a sort of DIY culture that in many ways is still associated with cassettes to this day. Home taping did, however, hurt the profits of record labels, so they invested a decent amount of money into creating a new format that would appeal to listeners. Compact discs came into the picture in the mid-80s. They began sweeping music sales in the 90s, eventually accounting for over 95% of annual recorded music sales at one point. CDs had it all. They had great sound quality, they were pretty durable, easy to store, cheap to manufacture, and there wasn't any practical way to pirate music with them. At the time, another advantage was their maximum runtime, which is usually about 80 minutes. More or less, that's double the capacity of one LP. Fairly quickly, there began to be a lot more lengthy albums, since vinyl limits were no longer the default thing to work by. I don't have, exact data for this, but think of pretty much any classic hip-hop or R&B album released around the late 90s or early 2000s. There are so many that hit 70 minutes, it's crazy. Obviously, those aren't the only genres where that shift happened. There's plenty of sprawling rock projects. As much as I love music from around that time, God, some of it is exhausting to listen through as albums. Also, one way that CDs were different was the method by which they stored music. Cassettes and records recorded sound in an analog way, whereas discs were loaded up with up to 700 megabytes worth of lossless digital files. Additionally, this means that they could be used as file storage devices in general, but nowadays that capacity wouldn't get you too far. Back in the 80s, though, that was a ton of space. In fact, those music files were so large that a single song couldn't fit on most computers. Ergo, companies at the time didn't fret very hard about piracy because it was evidently impractical, especially compared to tapes. The sole form of security put on the vast majority of discs was a type of copy protection called the BOZO bit. It got its name from being so weak that only a bozo would make use of or be dissuaded by it. Obviously, after a few years, hard drive sizes shot upwards and compressed file types for music like MP3s were developed, meaning that a song took up around a couple megabytes instead of 70. Sure enough, people started ripping their CDs onto their computers and sharing them through peer-to-peer services like good old Napster and LimeWire. So what I'm saying here is that, thanks to lack of foresight, compact discs played a large role in the end of music having any monetary value. In the case of music piracy, as we all know, record labels went against it really hard at first. There were a lot of lawsuits. They even attempted to target people who ripped CDs at one point. Of course, the problem with that is the fact that any effective copy protection would mean deviating from compact disc standards. Inevitably, controversies arose. Quite possibly the most insane form of DRM I've ever even heard of is Sony's Extended Copy Protection, also called XCP. Essentially, at one point, some Sony discs were sold that automatically installed malware onto PCs that prevented any CDs from being ripped by converting the end product into white noise. It was very difficult to remove and even led to computers becoming vulnerable to other worse malware. Needless to say, people were not pleased. The music industry had dealt with this dilemma once before. When home taping was starting to really hurt their sales, they solved it not by lobbying for a tax on blank cassettes, but by creating a superior product that was seemingly harder to exploit. When CDs eventually became a catalyst for piracy, labels once again tried brute force at first, but it still didn't work. They needed to make something better. So, take everything that makes piracy convenient, leave out most of the annoyances and sketchy stuff, make sure it's profitable, boom, it's Spotify. In fact, streaming services made file sharing so irrelevant to the wider public that you can still find certain peer-to-peer programs, such as which have basically any album you can think of, and 99% of the time, it'll be in high quality. And record labels literally do not care. So anyways, if you're keeping track, the desire for portable music led to 8-tracks, which were dropped in favor of cassette tapes, but those were too easy to pirate, so CDs were pushed to the top instead, which then indirectly helped digital music piracy blow up and set the stage for streaming services. Now nobody pays for most things they listen to, including myself. Music's value as a commodity is gone, God is dead, and BANDCAMP is now owned by FORTNITE. You might have been wondering where tapes and records were during the whole disc to LimeWire to Spotify progression. And the answer is nowhere, kinda. LPs, which had dominated since the end of World War II, had become a fraction of the market by 1990, and a decade later, tapes had fallen to a similar place. CDs were on top of sales since then, slowly but surely ceding ground to downloads and streaming over the past 20 years or so, and that trend will likely continue until something new comes along to kill Spotify. But I reckon that we're closer to the end of the world than the end of streaming, to be honest. Up to this point, all of this has been in terms of how most people choose to listen to stuff in a practical sense. Physical formats may never again be widely adopted for that purpose, but that doesn't mean there aren't other ways in which they can be sold. And funnily enough, the very issues that motivated companies to create and refine audio formats are now a part of the novelty. It is high time we talk about the vinyl resurgence. Records are pretty neat. If you have a good turntable, some speakers, and a few decently mastered LPs, it's quite a chill experience. I've had a modest collection going since 2018, though I've barely bought any in the past couple years since I've had less access to a record player. I know people hype them up when it comes to quality, and I'm not an audiophile. VO MP3s are all I really need, but mostly when it comes to older albums, vinyl can sound really good. I noticed that for the first time with Rumors by Fleetwood Mac. So there's a few factors that have given records a new appeal, those being the experience of actually spinning them, the quality, the collectability, since some pressings are scarcer than others. There's also the admittedly shallow appeal of having a big old printout of an album's artwork on the packaging, and by extension the colorful plastic variants of the LPs themselves. All this may not seem that huge, but I mean the trend speaks for itself. Vinyl has now returned to being the top grossing physical music format. I'm sure there was a decent amount of marketing in order to grease the wheels, but even after a few years, consumers seem to still be getting more interested. But things are a little different when it comes to the production side of things. As with many industries, the supply chain for records is it's bad. It's in really, really bad shape, and there's several reasons why. I mentioned towards the start of the video that vinyl hadn't changed a whole lot since the 40s, when LPs and singles were standardized. This means the creation process has stayed relatively consistent throughout the decades, and since it was unpopular for a while, there wasn't much motivation to keep it modern. Going into 2020, it would be quite vulnerable to disruptions in the event of, a global pandemic or an essential factory burning down. Of course, both of those things did end up happening simultaneously. COVID's effect on production doesn't require much explanation, but the reason that one factory was significant is because it produced lacquers, which are needed in most instances if you want to put a new album on vinyl. This factory that burned down was one of 2 lacquer producers left in the entire world. You can imagine what happens when one singular place is tasked with making a vital ingredient for every single new record. As you might imagine, this has caused problems. To add insult to injury, naturally, PVC, a major material used in records, has shot up in price. Demand is not dropping though, which means the companies still really want this stuff to be made. There are some plans to open factories in order to alleviate these supply line issues, but obviously those things take a while. Meanwhile, we're starting to really see how artists are being affected, and there's quite a bit of disparity depending on the size of an artist or label. Basically, most indie records are pushed to the back of the line because of the fact that major labels are the ones that can order in bulk. There are rumors going around that big labels are in cahoots and secretly paying vinyl manufacturers to put them first and kick indies out of the business. Stranger things have happened, but there's no real reason to make this into a conspiracy when it just makes sense from a business perspective for factories to cater to the clients asking for tens of thousands of units rather than just a few hundred. That's not to say it isn't really unfortunate that it takes an unbelievably long amount of time for smaller artists to get their stuff pressed through though. I mean, you had Adele complaining about a 6-month wait time for her album. To be clear, that's a long time. That's 2 trimesters right there. But good lord, based on what independent labels have to deal with, that's not even that bad. Some of them report around 6 to 8 months, but others put in the 1 to 2 year range. I can't even imagine sitting on a completely finished piece of work for a month, let alone a year plus. Obviously, it's an even bigger deal if you need a return on investment when it comes to all the money spent on recording and production. This stuff can be hard to gauge from a listener's perspective because when you look at a record store, you're probably not going to see empty shelves. Where you really see the effect is the amount of time it takes for indie albums to get released especially. One example of this I can think of is the vinyl pressing for Weather Days Come In, mostly because that was one of 2 records I bought that year. That one was initially announced in January of 2021 by Top Shelf Records and didn't go up for pre-order until 6 months later in July, and it didn't end up arriving for me until December. That's pretty wild, but imagine if the album hadn't been released before. Big Thief's newest album, Dragon New War Mountain, I'm not saying the whole title, was recorded all the way back in 2020 over the course of a few months, and I distinctly recall someone in the band saying that the album was done in April 2021 or so. 10 months later, in February 2022, after a tumultuous 6-month-long rollout, it finally released. For a pretty direct comparison, I'm sure there are differences, but for the most part it's not dissimilar. We can look at Adrienne Lenker's latest solo album, which was recorded a few months before the Dragon sessions began, and had a presumably shorter post-production process since it was a less complicated project. That album was done recording in May 2020, rollout began in September, and the album dropped in October, so 5 months more or less. Also, it was the best album ever made, but that's neither here nor there. In Big Thief's case, their approach to coping with holding on to a completely finished album for nearly a year was to play everything live in concerts beforehand, which, good for them. The question is, when does this just become impractical? The examples I've given here are relatively anecdotal because I'm not in the industry, but obviously this is happening, and it's even worse for less popular genres outside of pitchfork indie. It's the conflict between wanting your stuff to be on vinyl so you can get some amount of revenue outside of streaming and not waiting an insane amount of time for that. There are alternative music formats, though neither cassettes or CDs are likely ever going to have a resurgence on the level of vinyl, though I could be wrong there. Tapes have always been a lot more associated with DIY culture and smaller artists putting them out, and that's definitely really cool. Some of my most prized items related to music are cassettes that I've bought from artists that are handmade. I will probably never play most of those tapes, however, and that's just due to the fact that it's a pain in the ass and it doesn't even sound good. Cassettes, more than any other format, are a symbol of your direct support for an artist. That's a respectable niche, just not one that could take over vinyl like it once did in the 80s. Compact discs, on the other hand, are a slightly more likely contender. The main issue with them is their distinct lack of flaws. That's partially what made them dominant in the previous decades, but now people are more inclined to appreciate a little quirkiness when it comes to their physical music. It does help that they're less expensive than records, and most cars still possess CD players, at least in my experience. I'm not sure if the newer ones are getting rid of them. Also, importantly, the aphorism about things from 20 years ago becoming popular again because of nostalgia is starting to hold true here as well. Y2K aesthetics are apparently on the rise. I don't know, I've lost touch with my youth in my elder teenage years. 2021 was actually the first time in years that CD sales increased, though that was mostly Adele's doing. Still, that's not nothing. If we see an actual long-term trend start to develop around discs, it wouldn't be shocking. In the meantime, let's just hope that the vinyl supply chain gets fixed in the next few years, I suppose. Alright, so I'm recording this intro right after I finished editing the video finally. It's kind of an ambitious premise, so I presume there will be mistakes that people will point out in the comments. First of all, I've heard that Thomas Edison didn't create the method to play phonograph cylinders, but I looked into it a bit and I couldn't really find anything. Just know he's the one who patented the stuff, but didn't necessarily come up with it. Also, I don't want to overstate how large of a role that Apollo Factory Fire played in vinyl shortages, but it was definitely a signal of things to come. And I realize I don't have a firm conclusion for this video because I can't predict the future of physical music. I mean, it certainly isn't looking good for indie artists, but older records are a much larger part of the vinyl market anyways, and those aren't printed by indie labels. So small artists might be stuck on digital platforms, which has its benefits, though streaming is not artist-friendly by any means, and it may not be profitable. Like, Spotify's constantly bleeding money, it seems. I know I joked about BANDCAMP getting bought by Epic, but I mean, it says something about how successful it's been in the past couple years that FORTNITE has its eyes on it at all. Actually, assuming this video comes out on the 1st, tomorrow is BANDCAMP Friday, and that's always a great time to support artists if you can. Okay, well, that's it for talking about music. Now I want to take a couple moments to give a channel update. So it's been a while. Got a new channel name and everything. This video took me an embarrassing amount of time to make, mainly because I made some poor decisions with how I produced it, but it's not the only thing I've been working on. I have a few more scripts completely written and more that are getting there. As much as I'd like to make it a monthly thing, there's really no way I can guarantee that, but please make sure to like and subscribe. It would help out a whole bunch. See you next time.